Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Lund. My name is Andreas Aggestam. I'm an author and a speaker, and sometimes I get to host the Debatt in Lund, which is an institution by now in this academic epicenter of the Nordics. Debatt in Lund is a forum where we try to gather intelligent people who know a lot of things about specific things and then let them finish their sentences. This is completely unique in today's media landscape. But after all, we are a university and proud to be so. We're going to talk about Quran burnings today, which is of course a difficult and sensitive issue, but we're not going to be debating it for and against. That would be making a complicated issue way too silly and simplified. We're going to try to understand why this happens now. We're going to engage four amazing Lundian scholars to discuss this from different perspectives. Our goal? To try to understand a complex issue just a little better. You're all very welcome if you're joining us, if not in flesh, but in spirit over television. But most of all, welcome to all of you who are filling the Grand Hotel here in Lund tonight. So what are we up to for the next hour? Well, first of all, I think you're going to understand it even better if you get to meet our esteemed panelists. And let me start on my far left, your far right, the Professor of Islamic Studies, Oliver Scharbrodt. Please also extend your welcome to the researcher in human rights, Karin. Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies is here too, Karin Aggestam. Last but not least, from the legal department, this is Wilhelm Persson. Thank you so much. 10 years ago, nobody would have foreseen this, I don't think. And my first question to you must be, as we're going to be discussing this from many perspectives, why now? Why are some random people burning holy books right now? Why are they doing it in Sweden? What is their end game? What sort of decisions led up to 2023? And I'll leave the floor open. I mean, I realize that's the first of many impossible questions tonight, but I thought you'd just get used to it right away. Oliver, you feel like?
Sure. I think, I'm sure my colleagues will talk specifically about the Swedish context, so I might place it in a wider transnational context. And I think one of the important political contexts which has created an environment to allow something like this to happen is the rise of right-wing populism. Now, this is obviously happening in Sweden, but it's not just an issue within Sweden. It's a transnational phenomenon. We see this across various European countries. This is a challenge, for other European countries as well. I mean, we just had yesterday two very important state elections in Germany, in Hesse, in the states of Hesse and Bavaria, and the German right-wing party, the AfD, became second in both elections. So I think, what we've seen among the many issues that right-wing populism in the European context, and to a certain extent also in the North American context, has addressed is Islam and the perceived challenge of growing Muslim minorities, the threat to the cultural homogeneity of European societies. So I think that is the overall transnational climate in which an environment is created that allows something like this to happen.
Okay, so it's a branch on a bigger tree then, Karin. Is that how we should understand it?
Yes, and I think that one has to reflect on, we normally, when we theorize in academia, we talk about favoring, enabling conditions. So I think one of them, obviously, is the polarization, the rise of the right-wing populists that we see in Europe, in Sweden and elsewhere, that provides this fertile ground for actors to make use of it. And they do it for very different agendas. So it's not always obvious what the sort of actors burning the Quran, the intention, the agenda, and the publics that they do. So I think that's on the one hand. And the other one, obviously, is also the securitization. We live in a very securitized environment.
Let me just stop you there. The securitized, that's a word
Securitized in the sense that the reference today is less about peace politics and more about security. We have geopolitics at play here. And that's again also political actors who may make use of that because it provides, that's the sort of other factor that I think is critical here, it provides a public space. Now the public space today, it's very much on social media. So, and we're talking not about statements so much and text, it's actually the power of the visual images of burning the Quran. It's so powerful and it travels so quickly from the local to the national, to the transnational, to the Middle East, and then we see the full ramifications. Now this is a very powerful tool by one critical act, as we have seen here, one specific individual who can make use of these kind of favoring conditions for this kind of actions.
So that's the media analysis, that we live in a perfect storm when it comes to amplification of content without context, really. So that's how that can be used. Karin?
Yes, but I think when we're talking about the security state or the securitization of the state, we also have to understand what it thrives off. And it actually thrives of insecurities. It thrives of division. It thrives of fear. And if we're talking about some sort of endgame here for the far-right nationalists, which I would call them, because this is not any banal form of nationalism that we are dealing with, I think that it has been actually maybe not exactly foreseeable, but also not really a surprise that they are taking these steps and moving in this direction at this time. And going back to the question about securitization and insecurity, is that what they do and what they thrive of is thinking that there is some kind of enemy within that where there are hostilities that we cannot, they are like, they are, will never cease to be. And therefore, like that insecurity within the nation state is the kind of modus operandi here. So I just wanted to kind of like develop a little bit on that point on security, that it's not about, it's not so much about looking at outside threats. It's about blurring the line between external and internal threats. So you have reasons for the far-right nationalists to domestically kind of pacify the political space, and do that through also repression and these calls for, you know, harsher punishments and so on, and we've seen already moves towards mass incarcerations, detention centers, and dividing. If we talk about the public space, which Karin was mentioning as well here, we also have that new idea, well, it's not a new idea, but it has been thriving now lately, dividing citizenship from nationality. I think this is some of the grounds that we are.
So it's immediately incredibly complex. And before we go even further into depth, Wilhelm, I'd like to hear your take too on what is it that places us here in the fall of 2023.
Yeah, I was about to say that I have no answer from a legal perspective. The law is the same. Nothing has really changed in that matter. But perhaps something has changed in the attitude. Perhaps there are a raised awareness of human rights and civil and political rights that makes the police more cautious of interfering in such events, and perhaps the demonstrator more courageous in stating the legal arguments of their right to speak. So perhaps there is a shift from now from, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago.
Right. Can I maybe also add something in response to this, to these very important points? I mean, there has been a lot of focus on Muslim minorities, the question of integration, Quran burning. I'm sitting here as a professor of Islamic studies, but I think it just happened to be targeting Muslim minorities because they are the most significant minority population in contemporary European societies. It's a growing minority. If it were different, if another ethnic, religious, cultural group would constitute significant minorities in European societies, they would be targeted by this discourse. So I don't think it's a problem with Islam as such or Muslim as such. It's just they are perceived or they're constructed within this particular discourse, the securitized discourse, as the enemy within,
right,
because they sort of challenge perceptions of cultural homogeneity of European societies.
But then we have to ask ourselves this: what is the difference in Sweden, 2023, between burning a Torah, a Quran, and a Bible? What's the political significant difference?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to understand this without an analysis of power here. Or I mean, I agree with you, Oliver, that it's not Islam per se, but we have to understand the context of this, where we have a society that has been pointing fingers against specific groups of immigrants for a very long time now. So the question isn't like the Quran. They are not interested in the Quran. And if you forbade burning the Quran today, they would find another symbol for Islam to humiliate, to violate, right? So I'm thinking that it's all about the context. And it's about not there would be people who defend this and saying, oh, but look, this is against an authoritarian religion. They are just exercising a freedom of speech against a religion where defenders of this religion are very authoritarian, and these are these authoritarian countries and so on, right? Which is, I think, is just plain wrong foundation of the argument, because what you are doing is that by burning the Quran, you are kicking against a group of people, believers, who are already lying down in this society today. So I think that's one of the differences why burning the Quran today is different. Is different.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think it's really about reinforcing sort of who's the enemy. So, I mean, we know there are political parties, there's Islamophobia in Sweden, and it's like reinforcing and trying to trigger, that's what I was saying about the digital platform, triggering emotional outburst and pushing and actually also successfully triggering violence, which then reinforces the image of the problems in Sweden of violence, blurring together with segregation, with the very young criminals now that we see of shooting bombs. It sort of fits this meta-narrative. So it's about this. And we know also who has been active in these kind of discourses. So it feeds this image, and that makes it very different from burning the Bible or something like that. So even though there were groups, of course, and some people who would like to sort of just to make very clear that it would be something different. And we know also that there was one parliamentarian from the Liberal Party who then went, and he actually resigned later on because he made a difference. He said that's going to be a red line.
Right, yeah.
So it also reflects on who's considered the sort of the problem in society.
But so if I backtrack from both your statements, my conclusion then is that this is a part of a larger ambition to destabilize the nation. Is that fair to say? This is a part of a political narrative that found this way, but also could have found numerous other ways.
We're talking about intentions, and that's why I say we're talking about a broad range of actors here with very different agendas. We have, on the one hand, we also have the NATO process. We have President Erdogan, who has, his interest of destabilizing and to show that, Sweden is now really the most Islamophobic country. The proof is the burning of the Quran. We have, behind the scene also, Putin, who has constantly referred to the problem of multiculturalism in Western society and saying that that's sort of, showing the decadence and the slipping slope and whatever. And at the same time, stating that he's the defender or at the same time for minority rights and Muslim rights, making claims there. So there's many different agendas here at play. So I don't think there's sort of one intentions.
But then we have to go to Wilhelm to talk about law. Does intention matter when we judge the situation? Because it does in manslaughter and murder, right? Intention is everything there.
Yeah. Of course, to be criminal liable, you have to, as a main rule, have to do it consciously. So that's some kind of intention. But there are also different kinds of concept in penal law that moderates this. Sometimes it's enough to do something and to realize what the consequences will be. So, of course, it's worth to do something intentional, but if not, it could be criminalized anyway.
Anyway, so it doesn't have to mean the difference. So.
But can I ask Wilhelm a question?
Yeah.
So when it comes to then agitation against ethnic groups, would that matter? Because as it is now, this act is not up for discussion to ban or not ban, right? But it is tried as agitation against ethnic groups with the lack of better translations to English, right? Or hate speech. Does intention matter?
In the way that the main rule is it's the intentional act that is criminalized. But in cases when we are not sure about the intention, we could use different models to sometimes moderate that a little bit. But the main rule is, it's intentional. And I think in this context, I think that intention are reasonably clear, but of course, the main question from a legal perspective here, as I see it, is agitating against Islam the same as agitating against Muslims, and that is of course a difficult legal question.
Well, and we talked about different actors with different end games and what they want to do. Sometimes in academic research, you hear people talk about the seriousness of purpose. You value something. Oh, I'm going to do research on this. Yes, but why? What is the seriousness of your purpose here when you try to investigate this? These actors all seem, to me, as a layman, to lack seriousness of purpose. They don't have a serious purpose in changing society and creating a healthy debate, acting within the realms of democracy. They're trolls. How about we just ignore them? Can we just do that, Oliver?
I think that would be the best way to respond to it. But I think the problem is because, and again, Karin pointed this out, because these acts have become so viral and are transmitted transnationally, I think it's very difficult to ignore it. And I think there is a responsibility to take a stand on this. I mean, I came 10 days back from Iraq to do field work there, and this question was omnipresent. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised how, you had posters, we stand with the Quran, our Quran is sacred, and so on. So this has transnational repercussions, and Karin pointed already out, that has repercussions on Sweden's global standing, because I think, one of the strengths of Sweden as an international political actor has been its history of neutrality, being kind of an honest broker, being seen as a promoter of democracy and human rights, and, being very much involved in the Middle East and other Muslim majority countries in humanitarian aid. And I think this kind of standing is threatened with the increasing perception of Sweden being a particular Islamophobic country. And of course, you have certain other political actors that capitalize on this to tarnish the reputation of Sweden, to sort of amplify these sort of events as well. But that's something that I've seen in a particular context in the Middle East where this was omnipresent, and therefore I think we're at a stage where we can't ignore it. I think the question is, what would be adequate responses to it?
Yeah, Karin?
No, I just want to add, I think this is the way the Muslim communities in Sweden actually have tried, religious leaders saying to just ignore or be present, and some, way even, offering chocolate, like trying to dampen and like just managing the tension, because that if it gets, very heated and even violent, it actually feeds again the stereotypes. But the problem is, when it travels transnationally into the region, that's when the other agendas get hooked up. So it becomes a life of its own. So an individual that is ignored in Sweden, it wouldn't have that ramification. But it's because it goes viral, and it's then being hijacked for other political agendas in the Middle East. So now suddenly, Iran was, and the spiritual leader Khamenei was out there already saying, that we are at war with Sweden. We have to defend Islam. And as you were saying, there were big posters. And it's for other political purposes, because it's such a power of mobilization. It's amazing. So there's other agendas out there. So that's sort of the power that has to be considered and makes it so volatile. And again, the social media platforms are managing. And to control this, the media and the communication, it's notoriously difficult. The digital space is notoriously difficult
and I think,
to manage.
That's really where I think, as a democratic society, we should do better, because we have, rulers in political contexts that are not necessarily committed to democratic principles, and sometimes openly, admit this, sort of presenting themselves, posing as defenders of the rights of Muslim minorities in Europe. That's where I think, we as a democratic society have to be much more proactive to defend democratic values, and to show that, that these values and, the conception of pluralistic society provides mechanism for political inclusion and for democratic inclusion. And that is a sense that, or there's the danger that, a not insignificant segment of people of a Muslim background living in Sweden and other European countries feel that they're excluded out of the democratic process because they are particularly targeted, and things that they hold sacred are particularly targeted. Mm-hmm.
I would say that one thing that the Swedish secular state has been doing extremely badly, faring really ill the past decade or so, is, it's not enough to be neutral in relation to religion, but one has to practice tolerance, and tolerance has to be reciprocal. So, and I don't think that tolerance has been that in Sweden. It's been highly intolerant towards Islam. It's towards Muslim communities. So, and I think that not practicing tolerance makes it a really difficult case for now the so-called Swedish state, right? Because I'm saying it's so-called because authoritarian states expect other states to kind of behave authoritarian as well, saying that, the Swedish state is not stopping this or doing anything about it, and so on and so forth. And then the Swedish the representatives at the moment do not have a good answer.
But they also don't have the power, because we're not
but of course we're not authoritarian, right?
There's no way our prime minister can't call the local government and say, you must do this. We have laws against
But they can also not say we are proactive, or that we have been proactive in when it comes to tolerance between religious believers, between different religious communities in this country.
Well, so here's a thought then. We sometimes, when we discuss, we're a very secular country, obviously, and then we discuss these things, but we do it, we're trying to be sensitive to, I'm an atheist, I might give that up, and I'm talking to somebody who is a devout Christian. I try to be respectful of their personal faith in a particular way. It's a particular kind of respect that's different than if they were to voice a political opinion. We should have more nuclear power stations, or we should join the NATO. That's different. I respect your faith. But in the moment you take your faith and say that I'm going to write a law that regulates through the nation state how you live your life, then I must forget that respect and immediately move to a point where I say that's a political opinion like any other. And that distinction, I found, has been difficult to make in Sweden because we're not practicing it. Am I onto something there? Is there a lack of cultural understanding is really where I'm going.
Yes, I think you're spot on that. And I think that we actually need to engage in this discussion. I mean, Sweden is an outlier here when it comes to...
How?
In the sense of being so extremely secular and the strong emphasis on individual rights. And then at the same time, we have to recognize, as you were saying, like practicing tolerance. This is a long-standing tension, what you're describing, between, secularism and freedom of expressions, very focused on the individual freedom, autonomy, integrity, and at the same time talking about the respect of religious beliefs and communities and all of that. And of course, Sweden has changed in the sense, if we look like with migration and other communities coming in. And Sweden until the 1970s had the law, and that's where you have to fill in on a blasphemy. But it's like something that was considered not, it's a step forward of having this separation and actually making religion extremely private. So the problem is that, as you said, practicing tolerance and to manage the changing socio-political context, Sweden hasn't grasped that. And that's why I think there's sort of a cultural gap or an intercultural misunderstanding here also going on. And that's why we need to nurture this kind of, this dialogue and understanding and to reach out, but also recognize the tension, because this is a long-standing tension that I think a lot of countries are struggling with. Like blasphemy again, I think it's like 1/3 of the countries in the world who have a law, but 2/3 don't. But then they regulate in a different way.
Let's put a pin in that and just go to Willem quickly, because you were onto something really important. Blasphemy laws, we have had them here in this country, and then we don't. Can you just walk us through that? How have we been dealing with blasphemy in the Swedish social legal aspect?
Yeah, well, if you have a long historical perspective, of course, Sweden wasn't tolerant at all. It was very harsh on the pure Christian beliefs, and that continued and weakened less after time until 1970s, when we abolished the laws on blasphemy. And then what was criminalized then was anyone who publicly insults that is held sacred by the church or another religious community active in the country is sentenced to a fine or imprisonment for violation of religious freedom.
When is this?
So, up until 1970. Then the parliament debated this and came to the conclusion that, well, we have now such free society that it seems very unlikely that it would be any problem concerning this. And if there would be problems, well, we have other laws that could criminalize wrong behavior. So it was a combination of, well, we have other laws and perhaps a naive, or at that time totally correct judgment that we don't need this crime anymore.
All right. So someone might argue that under the umbrella of freedom of speech, you should be allowed to say anything anywhere all the time. That is obviously not the case. It would be illegal to the classic example is to yell fire, fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. There are limits to freedom of speech in all kinds of interesting ways. How do we approach this? And I'm going to start with you, Oliver, since you're the only non-Swede in the panel. Do you, living and working in Sweden, do you perceive Sweden as a religiously preaching freedom of speech? Are we an outlier there?
I don't think Sweden is necessarily an outlier. I think there is a particular perception of Sweden being a secular society. And I understand where this is coming from, but I would query this a little bit. Because, I'm following here a particular scholar who has been very influential in Islamic studies, in the anthropology of Islam, Tal al-Assad. And his argument is that secularism is not really separation of religion and state. secularization means that the state puts religion in a particular place, defines religion in a particular way, and it's okay to be religious here. And I think that's sort of my sense that I see in Sweden, where there is a strong sort of self-identification, we are a secular society and so on, but it's really that there's an understanding it's okay to deal with religion, to articulate religious beliefs and so on in a particular context. And there is a strong emphasis of, if you like, an internalized cultural understanding of Protestantism. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it means to be Swedish. And any religious group that challenges this kind of internalized cultural understanding of Protestantism is seen as a challenge to the secular order.
Well, then I have to ask you this. Our Prime Minister, Kristersson, his wife was recently finishing her studies to become a Lutheran priest, and she appeared in a government meeting with the priest collar as a part of her official outfit. This led to debate. Should she, as the wife of our Prime Minister, really be representing Sweden wearing her religious work outfit? Or should you just say, of course, that's her job, that's what she usually wears now. That's no biggie, we just don't understand it. Which is it?
Well, I think that's a classic example. There has been a consensus, okay, this is the place of religion, and anybody who sort of challenges this kind of comfortable position, that's seen as a problematic. Yeah, and this is sort of one example of where there's a sort of consensus challenge. And of course, this is challenged by religious groups, and this is not something just specific to Islam. I think this is also specific to Catholicism, to Orthodox form of Christianity, to evangelical forms of Christianity, who feel that religion should play a role in public life. Right. And I think, we've become quite comfortable. We've solved religion. We know how to deal with it. We have it, it plays a role, we don't talk about this.
And we put it over here.
Yeah, we put it there. We put it in a nice box, and sometimes comes out and we put it back in the box. But I think the religious diversity that is now part and parcel of European societies, and of course Muslim minorities are particularly example, they challenge the kind of comfortable consensus we've reached around religion.
So maybe freedom of speech is our religion then. Karin, look, you're a human rights researcher. The freedom of the religion, the freedom of speech. This is an interesting conflict here.
Potentially, yes. But it really depends on how you understand it, right? So of course, when it comes to I think one helpful way of understanding the conflict here that you describe, Oliver, is, and this is other scholars who have done work on this, on the meaning of freedom of religion, and it being an inner freedom, right? Something that you yourself have, but also something that is external. And without that external component, the practices together with others, it doesn't make any sense, or doesn't make much sense. And this is a similarity with freedom of expression. So freedom of expression, we tie it up, and then in this extreme form of it, we look at the US Constitution, where freedom of expression isn't very, very clearly an individual right. And this is also how it has been treated really so much, and also in the Swedish debate. But we haven't been asking the question, what is needed for it to be practiced? It doesn't make sense to have it individually. It makes sense in society. It makes sense in community. It makes sense together with others. So we also have to look at what are the places that are being regulated, that regulate indirectly freedom of speech. And we can look at authoritarian countries and see that, but they have freedom of speech, yet people are put in jail for speaking out, right, for utterances. So we have to look at the arenas in Sweden where freedom of speech has been kind of limited, like freedom of assembly, freedom of association, of organization, and kind of, and that isn't like nobody has banned you from organizing, but perhaps just taking away the material foundation for it, the resources for it. And I think that when it comes to freedom of expression, it is all this thinking of it as something that needs, we also have to have other parts of institutions that supports it. And And we can talk about rights as something, something very instrumental, something that we find in the law. But we can also understand it as particular values, and that we need rights to protect these values. And I think that freedom of expression, as well as religious freedom, freedom to religion, are these kind of universal values of which we know that human beings cannot thrive. Societies cannot thrive. And thinking of them rather as values, we have to start thinking of what do we need to do institutionally to protect them and make them flourish and not just.
Well, that makes for an excellent segue to what we really need to be focusing on now. How we generally can do better. What we can do at many different levels. Our personal understanding, just cooling the feelings off a little bit, if we feel so inclined, making diplomatic progress, and just try to cool the situation off. Karin, can we start with you here a little bit? What should be done right now on a multilateral level? Where can we start to cool the situation off and learn better?
Well, I think there's different arenas where it's already being done. I mean, diplomatically, we know in the region. I mean, the Foreign Office has been working around the clock.
What do they do?
Well, they have all different kinds of dialogues with both state officials, including civil society actors in the region, just trying to manage that, because the larger picture is, of course, the ramification, again, as we know that we have other considerations when it's also come to the NATO membership. So it's like just trying to cool off, and that's. But the problem, I think, for the government has been, on the one hand, being very clear and condemning the act, and that's where the legal perspective must come in as well, condemning the act, or even, putting it very clearly that it's racist, it's an Islamophobic act of burning the disrespectful, trying diplomatically to signal this is not representing the government, but at the same time, the images is still having the police passively observing when somebody burns the Quran. These are the images that travel. So it's very hard to be credible in that way. But I think there has been a broad range of dialogues going on. And I think also with the communities in Sweden, religious communities, trying to also to find ways of, that, as we talked about before, trying to ignore so you don't get this ramification. I know that the state institutions and the community and the police, even in Malmö, has been working, they have also some experience from this before, so they have been trying also to manage the tension. Because they know that how it becomes problematic. But I'm just thinking about the legal perspective again, because I'm just thinking, I'm not coming in here as a legal scholar, so I just wonder about the Supreme Court, for instance. It's high time, because what we are talking about is the practice and the limitation and the space. So yes, we will look like, what does the Supreme Court say about this? That's one thing. And the other one is, of course, all the ongoing legal cases that are now going on, and they will present precedents. So where we actually may hopefully come to practice where this is being considered that there will be legal repercussions for actors.
The law we have to put the foot down,
Quran.
right? You have some people who will say that we're fine having any culture in Sweden, but we can only have one law. So the difference is here is, of course, what can we settle with culture, and where do we have to move into law? Wilhelm, my question to you, of course, is: do we need to write ourselves some new laws really quickly right now?
Yeah, well. We don't know that yet.
So that's a no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Well, you may elaborate.
There are pending court, at least one pending court case. There are prosecutors investigating whether to prosecute or not. So the frustrating thing here is that law take slow steps. We have to wait to see what do the prosecutors say, and then we have to say what do the courts say, and then we have to see what do the appeal courts say, and then we have to wait to see what the Supreme Court say. So that takes, from a media perspective, an eternity, and not many people have the patience to wait. They want action before.
There's a court case now in Linköping in Sweden, right? There's somebody who did burn a Quran in an offensive way, and what they're trying to do, just to brief you if you're not up to speed on that one, they're trying to see if this works as hets mot folkgrupp, which I don't know how we would translate that into English. What is the term?
That is agitation against a national or ethnic group.
Right, so that's the law that we already have. We're trying to see if that should or can be used. That's going to be a Supreme Court case. That's your prediction?
You never know, but the chances are good.
Yeah.
But that situation is not really the same as burning a Quran in a demonstration, because this was in a private
they left the book there.
Private setting, and they were taping it, and there were special music.
Special music.
Yeah,
so there's an obvious political context, but no live crowd.
No.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, that's the difference. I'm going to ask the rest of you. You're not in the legal department of the university, but I'm still going to ask you this. How do you feel about the stance of our law, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion? Are we good, or do we need to make some changes?
I can understand the debate around the legal parameters and how it is important. But I think we need to move beyond this as well. And I think, with all respect to Wilhelm, I think the law is not the solution to all our problems, because you already touched upon, Andreas, that there are limitations to freedom of speech, and there are sometimes legal limitations. But I think beyond this, there is an informal setting that delimits freedom of speech. These are social conventions.
Mm-hmm. Don't be an idiot to other people.
Yes, how we engage particularly with minority communities. I don't think, and I might be wrong, there is a law against using the N-word. But we are in a society where we think it's inappropriate, it's indecent. A decent person doesn't use this kind of word.
Right.
So something that has been sometimes attacked as sort of political correctness. How do we engage with minorities? And again, we had the learning curve.
Yeah, and again, I've never heard anybody suggest that we should legally abolish a word like that, and that's a pretty obvious concern. Now, Karin, I want to hear from you too. Do you think we need to do some legal work?
No. That's the short answer. But I know that a lot of people put kind of like hope into this law and into the court cases on agitation against ethnic and national groups. But I'm a little bit cautious about this, as well as I'm cautious when it comes to talking about, we need to restrict certain type of acts. We need to restrict the burning of holy books, for instance, which has been on the table and discussed, right? Because I'm thinking when it comes to the possible restrictions, that I'm thinking it's the wrong way of thinking about the freedom of expression, because the freedom of expression cannot be, it is not, and it cannot be conditioned by what is in the utterance, or what is being said, or what is being done, right? So the expression, so a speech or artwork or whatever, does not in themselves manifest freedom of expression. And they should not. It cannot be the measurement either. So we have to be really careful by saying that, because you are speaking up against freedom of expression, hence you are not allowed to talk. That is the wrong way of measuring it, right? It has a value in itself. So I think that burning the Quran does not inherently or essentially is not like this expression of the virtue of freedom, but hence it's not the waving of the American flag either. It's also not in itself inherently an expression of freedom. And a logical conclusion then of this reasoning is that we cannot use freedom of expression as a measurement to know what to allow or not to allow. And also, therefore, I am a little bit cautious. I think this law, the agitation against ethnic group, it's from 1948-49, if I'm not, So it does have a very clear historical connection to the Holocaust, and I think it does serve several purposes. But I am also very cautious about relying on the law to solve political, social questions.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a broader debate that moves beyond the law. Again, how do we engage? Again, we've learned what words we use, what language we use when engaging with other minorities. And I think there needs to be something similar happening with Muslim minorities, with other religious minorities that, cannot be covered by the law. Maybe it shouldn't be covered by the law, but it's more a kind of consensus within society. We don't do these sort of things.
But let's talk more about that then. Let's forget about the law for a moment. Let me ask this again. How can we do better as a society?
Well, in my view, I mean, it's part of the larger picture and problems that we have with segregation also. I mean, it's a part that we need to get intercultural dialogues. We have to have more of meeting arenas to debate, contest, argue, because that's how we practice our actually freedom of expression as well. So it's to have these sort of meeting arenas, and I would say Sweden is a highly segregated society, and it's sort of almost like a dialogue between deaf people here, like no understanding also. So it's also like we need to find critical arenas, critical actors, bridge builders, and there are people out there. I think there's lots of people who are engaged on this, and we need to recognize the force and the power and the opportunities that lies there. Because again, as you were saying, the legal system works very slowly. But I think there's also a lot of questions for many of us that you can't use the law when it's so clearly provocative and so considered hateful act. So I think even, it's not only about, certain groups not understand. It's actually, I think, a general question mark among Swedes as well. So we need to have these, debates going in different, locations
different
and
yes.
different communities.
I mean, it's not that I disagree with you. I kind of agree, but I also think that when we talk about segregation, it's ridiculous talking about it as if it is a little bit abstract. I think it is very, very clear that we have an economic segregation, and it is really the Muslim population that is faring really, really not good, and immigrants that are faring not good in this society. And not only them, of course, but that we have this economic segregation, inequality, that serves inequality in the political as well. So the political space is not equal because we are not a society of equals, really. And I think that is really something to handle, and that is a proper challenge, really.
The solutions you're talking about seem daunting, as all problems do in our time. Wilhelm, you're a man of the law, but let me hear your ideas on what we can do aside of the law. What do we need as a society to do before we go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, first, I totally agree that the world wouldn't be really a nice place if everyone used their freedom of expression to the maximum. The law don't solve the problem there. We have to somehow, in dialogue, in the society, settle our differences in other ways and promote this conversation between different groups.
I cannot believe the physical meeting too. The fact that you are all here tonight is a wonderful thing, and just the whole thing, the difference between the empathy that you build through a screen or live is going to be different for every issue. If we try to kind of narrow down a to-do list, a wish list, things we could do if we have unlimited funds, where would you all start if you were made kings for a day? Oliver, what would be your first move?
Well, I think we need to, as a professor of Islamic studies, being in the center of theology and religious studies, I think we need to increase religious literacy. We have been perceiving ourselves as being secular, religion is sorted, and I think we have to relearn religion, and we have to understand that for a significant number of people living in Sweden, living in Europe, religion plays an important role. What does it mean for them? How do we interact with them? How we show respect? I mean, this was a word that was mentioned many times. How do we deal with the sensitivities? And I think we've unlearned many things as part of the secularization of European societies and how we sort of dealing with Christianity. But I think we have to relearn certain things, and a religious literacy is in this regard very important. And I think there are obviously many outreach activities done by mosque communities and so on, but I think we also need to start appreciate the contributions that immigrants generally have made to European societies and to Swedish societies. I mean, if you look at the Swedish health sector, if you look of how many people are employed in the Swedish health sector that have a Muslim background, and I think that is, maybe for responsibility for Muslims or Muslim communities to highlight their contribution, but also for us to recognize, these people have made important contributions to our society, and certain sectors of society wouldn't function the way they're functioning now if we didn't have immigration.
Anybody else feels to be a king for a day or queen for a day?
I'd build more houses.
More houses?
Yeah.
How so? Why is that important?
Well, part of the social segregation is also a lack of housing, affordable housing. It is, I don't want to say too much about this because it's something else here, but it's also a matter of who can afford to live where and participate in the political space.
It makes perfect sense.
And
I
the
don't
public
think you're far off
space.
at all.
And if you have very segregated areas that are far off from the center of Stockholm or Göteborg or Malmö, you also have different spheres of people. Of course you will chat with your neighbors and your kin, right? Those that you feel familiar with. But as long as these lines are drawn on economic basis, it's going to be really difficult to reconcile.
You're not far off. That makes perfect sense, at least to me. Karin, what do you want to do?
What I want to do, I don't want actually to end pessimistic, but I want to say something about politics, because there are worrying signs that we actually need to reinvigorate politics. We need to, and I think it's especially thinking about, established traditional parties. They are not reaching out. And we're not only talking about Muslim minorities here, we're talking about young people. So this is quite urgent. So I think that we seriously need to rethink politics and we should be able to contest. We should be able to agree to disagree. That's part of politics. It's not about consensual politics. And I think actually the reason why we are now seeing the rise of right-wing populism is partly part of the problem has been a very consensual politics developing in Sweden, where the difference between the Social Democrats and the Liberals or the Conservatives has not been all that clear. We know the moderates were referring themselves in the election as in a few elections back as the new Labour Party. So it's blurring the line, and that provides this amazing platform, a vacuum, political vacuum for the populists, the right-wing populism growing. So I think we need to sort of reinvigorate politics on all levels. To address and you do this through this kind of intercultural dialogues and also addressing the dissonance. That's a huge dissonance in society that needs to be addressed and recognized. To start from there.
Vida?
Yeah, well, I really don't have much to add to all this analysis, but from a legal perspective, perhaps I could take the opportunity to pitch another set of rules that they usually pitch, and that's the disorderly conduct crime.
Disorderly conduct would Swedish be förargelseväckande beteende.
Exactly.
Lovely to old.
And that is a person who behaves in a manner apt to arouse public indignation shall be sentenced for this crime. This is a different kind of rules. The agitation against a minority that focus on the content of the speech, but this focus on the forms of the speech. So you should, regardless of the message, you should behave in an orderly manner. And you could perhaps say that, well, burning things isn't very orderly. And we could discuss whether we need rules to promote a more constructive dialogue than burning things. Of course, that comes with problems too. How shall we decide what is disorderly and not, and that is of course very different from different people. But I think we not only could see the content of the speech, but also the way how to express yourself. Should there be some kind of restrictions against that?
So we've put some emphasis now on the general need in Sweden of trying to understand our own internationality and trying to understand better and crack segregation. We do have, and hope to get even more online, people watching this on TV, an international audience perhaps looking in. What do you want to explain in 30 seconds each about what is particularly Swedish? What is it about Swedish people that you want to teach in an approach to make something reciprocal again, teach and learn at the same time? Oliver, being the newest Swede.
Yeah, I feel a bit uncomfortable here as the only non-Swede, but I want to quote somebody. There's this Arabic news service, Al Compis, and they did, in the wake of these burnings, they did just sort of like a street survey, what do people think on the street about these burnings. And there was a lady, middle-aged lady, who said something very interesting. She said, this burning the Quran, doing something offensive, this is very un-Swedish. We don't do these sort of things. We avoid confrontations. We avoid antagonizing other people. And I think, if there's sort of an argument put, well, freedom of expression, this is a Swedish. I think there's a different voice from this lady from the street who says, actually doing these sort of things, this is quite
burning the Quran is an un-Swedish thing to do. I think that's quite a valid point. Karin?
No, I don't know what is very Swedish. I'd say, I have not only lived in Sweden, I'd say that one view of Sweden, which I can kind of understand, is that it's a very self-conscious people who tend to seem quite ignorant at the same time, but trying really hard not to be. So trying really hard to be polite, but coming out as impolite. Trying really hard to be tolerant, coming out as almost intolerant. Due to this, trying to have hands off. So I think the self-consciousness can appear as ignorance. And I think that is something that needs to be understood.
That's a tough one. We all need to look in the mirror for that. Karin, what do you want to explain about the particular Swedish mindset to an international audience?
Well, I think that's, as Oliver was saying, the majority of Swedes would, say that they are extremely concerned with how this has resonated elsewhere, way beyond Sweden, and that it also creates a dissonance there because the self-image of Sweden is not that this would be possible to take place in Sweden, would not be tolerated. And I think a lot of Swedes, a majority of Swedes, we know that through opinion polls, really find this very frustrating that our legal system is not able to manage this in a more constructive way. So I think that sort of getting back to this self-image, which you can, of course, having opinions about, of being, standing up for human rights, like in the Middle East, supporting civil society who works in this area, in that particular region, they are struggling right now with this kind of, dialogues and they're trying to be persuasive in the sense that this is not representing Sweden. This is not represented. So I agree with what have been said by the other speakers. So there's a consensus here, right?
Right, of course, that's what we do. Wilhelm, what is particularly Swedish and important to be taught?
Well, I keep building on this consensus and the same stereotypes because I do think it could be considered un-Swedish to burn the Quran, and because of that, the Swedish legal system it hasn't been prepared for such a situation. It hasn't been tailored for burning things. It has been tailored for more self-conscious speech.
So we're not prepared for the rudeness of it. Ladies and gentlemen, we could go on all night. We shan't. We are getting on the full hour, and I'm about to wave goodbye to our television audience. We're going to have some time for questions and answers in the room. So next time, get here. We are at the University of Lund in the very south of Sweden. There is no cooler or nicer or happier place in Sweden. We're all kind. We're burning no books tonight. And inshallah, we'll see you very soon again for Debatt i Lund. Thank you very much for following us online and on TV.